I will quickly run through this. So this is Letty research work, which was building on work they'd previously done. And we started to begin to realize there were opportunities which weren't currently being addressed. And your discussions about non-joined up between opportunities rings real bells for us. So we were focusing particularly on the mass market, not the bespoke market. We realized we could potentially halve heat demand. That's heat demand, not the energy going into the heat pump because you switch to a heat pump. This is demand in dwellings for about 2/3 less cost than current whole house retrofit. And this involved identifying inefficiencies, looking at different products and processes and adaptations of products because they're not pitched for the market. Some of the undesirable consequences of the market, and then I'm sure we'll get onto critical mass for change. And here I just want to point to the document. It's a free download. It's about 200 pages. It covers an awful lot. And that's where I want to, shall we say, hang on, I have gone, this is the wrong presentation. My apologies for this.
No worries.
I don't want to take you all the way through. Let's have a look. Hang on to that one. That's the one I want. So why is that not coming up? My apologies for this.
Don't worry, Chris.
Share again. I'll try that. Share. That's it. There we are. Right. That's better. Compressed it.
Right.
So Letty's done a lot of work looking at best practice. For those of you who know Letty, Low Energy Transformation Initiative, their climate emergency design guide, they did an initial retrofit guide, which was looking at what best practice looked at like. And we realized going through that there was a very large other gap in the market. And once again, the report explains that, which was to do with the mass market who couldn't afford best practice. And we put together this work stream. Well, it was 7 work streams. And I have to say a big thank you to the 80 odd people who are involved in that. And we realized how much this is an interrelated issue. And we have work streams on fabric systems cost, stock models, looking at how we get to 2050 at 0 extra cost. We reviewed in depth what the CCC were looking at and why their advice to government isn't. It doesn't major on retrofit. One can talk about that separately. I won't talk about it today. And also the social aspects of it. And indeed, that's where we started. If you're moving from where we've been to date, which is largely larger houses, the eco enthusiasts and so forth looking at whole house retrofit, to the mass market, we suddenly have different kinds of housing types. These were the sort of feedback we started getting. I have no spare indoor space for that hot water cylinder that a heat pump wants. The retrofit offers are too expensive. Level of disruption, no informed and authoritative single contact. I'm sure we recognize most of these, but we started to use these as drivers for a different way of doing the retrofit. And we began to find it was this linkage, this integration of different components. we realized that there were easy gains if we were selective in the way we did interventions in fabric tones. We could knock 50% off the heating. Go much further than that, and the costs start to jump. We were looking at how could we reduce it down to a 7-day turnaround. At the moment, you tend to have someone go in, there's a mobilization for the first set of people come in, there's a mobilization therefore thereafter for the next, and you end up with a long process. So we started looking at that. We found a whole raft of things, for example, the lack of guarantees, the lack of warranties, the idea that the heat pump installer didn't rely on the insulation person achieving what he was supposed to do, for example, was creating bunts in the system and oversizing of heat pumps, for example. We then went to the community-based thing, local enablers, a lot of the sorts of things you've been talking about, single point of responsibility. Therefore, the idea of a different contractual arrangement, if part of eliminating what we found were 40% of the costs were going in overheads. We're finding each of the specialist trade contractors was doing their own surveys. Why not combine that all? So one person does a survey and he might then be able to afford to do it in more automated and some of the new technology, so he can do it quicker and get more information to the specialists. So you're not ending up with external wall insulation, people coming along and doing separate pull-out tests and so forth. But we also found, for example, the productivity, I'll come back to that, step change was needed. Then looking at new products, a simplified MVHR strategy, so mechanical ventilation, heat recovery, because basically we're only being offered the Rolls-Royce at the moment in the UK. But the idea of having that level of strategy implemented, it means you get some good, easy wins in air tightness terms. You're not worried about making sure there's a minimum level of ventilation because you've got through infiltration, because you've got a mechanical system doing it. And there's a lot of cheap ways of achieving air tightness, most of which we've had a dabble with ourselves, as it improves comfort. But we also identified we could potentially halve the heat pump size. I won't go into that in detail now, but the method used, the BS being used, isn't necessarily the most up-to-date version. The way hot water is sized and recovered reheat isn't in an integrated heat pump sizing method. The hot water store I'll touch on later. The principle of reusing every radiator you've already got, and indeed integrating that with the fabric. So in other words, you only do as much fabric as you need to make sure all those radiators can work with the lower temperature of a heat pump. And then moving on to fabric policy side, the idea, I'll touch on some of this in a moment, but once again, the report goes into considerable detail on a lot of this. And I suppose stepping back, one of the issues we found is we as an industry are on that green line on the left. We have not improved our productivity in delivery in the last 30 years. UK has marginally, not very good compared with a lot of other countries, but a lot of other industries have. We are still operating as a cottage industry. And once again, learning from other industries, the understanding of where you put the money, we can go to the exceptional quality, passive house benefit, so forth and so on, and you pay for an awful lot of approval of products, pre-approval, a lot of processes, and only going for the very best equipment, which means the costs are high. On the other extreme, in the UK, we tend to go for how can we get rid of all these softer things, and then the costs come back to hit us later when we've got mold and lack of proper ventilation and so forth and so on. understanding an optimum in the middle. What is it, using a slightly dated analogy, what is it that a Ford Escort used to deliver without having to go to a BMW? Ford Escort satisfied all the legislation, gave us a level of amenity, so forth and so on. Understanding those cost balances, because our industry isn't very good at that. And I won't go through here, but you'll find in the report a whole set of things that we were looking at. And it involved doing better surveying to start with, because at the moment we aren't choosing the most appropriate, and right through to doing HDC test afterwards to identify the performance you've actually delivered as part of that warranty process. This is one of the slides which one could spend an awful lot of time on, but it was very good having cost consultants within the team. And cost consultants, like all of the team, who are working as individuals, not under the auspices of their employer of the day job. So they could offer suggestions which their bosses probably wouldn't prefer they offer. But it allowed us to unstitch an awful lot of things. For example, where does the money actually go on a typical retrofit? And I'll just use one example, Windows. 81% of UK, I think it's 81%, or is it 89% of UK homes already have double glazing. Replacing that for triple glazing or high performance double glazing is a shed load of money, typically 14,000 per typical home, for example. What we don't have is an industry used to refurbishing existing double glazing. The idea of spending 800 quid, 800 quid to replace the hinges so the gaskets resettle and you recover the air tightness that you'd lost is something which no one is offering, for example. And that's just indicative of a whole set of things here. Once again, one could go through in more depth. And I'll just show you one example. If we're switching over to heat pumps, the images on the right are what the industry uses. Oh, great, doesn't it look great? Big heat pump in the back garden. So many of the typical homes do not have that kind of space. The glorious storage vessels and the plumber, people don't have that space. So the idea of beginning to look at, if you're halving the capacity of the heat, if you're changing the method you use for sizing it to use diversity, including hot water, and one can go into the technicalities of that, to actually end up with a heat pump which is sub 5 kilowatts, probably below 4 kilowatts for your average home, such that we can then do what we do in commercial world with DXAC unit. You mount them on the wall. You're then looking at a whole raft of things. We've introduced selective fabric first, such the radiators don't need to be touched. So all the pipework we can leave intact. Domestic hot water, we've rather missed the fact that Europe has now labeled hot water shower heads, for example, such that you've got high performance, low flow shower heads that you can order up, which can reduce your hot water demand by about a third. Then the idea of looking at a thermal store sized to slot into the space vacated by your combi boiler. So you're not losing a square inch of internal space. Possibly using a phase change. There's people like Sunamp and so forth that do them, but not of a size which fits into that space. HeatGeek are looking at some brilliant ways of reducing hot water cylinders and using more efficient heat exchange. All of that feeding into how you then fit this into a constrained home. And ultimately, the aim being, can we do all of this heat pump installation in less than 2 days? Can we get heat pump installing 5 heat pumps in 2 weeks as opposed to 1 or two, that is where you're looking at productivity gains for each of the constituent trades contributing. But this also flips on the high level upstream side. The pink is the electrical grid demand at the moment. The blue is if we switch to heat pumps, and you find the heat pumps define the capacity of the grid, but only for very short periods of the year. So it's an inefficient investment in the grid to get to that kind of capacity. The idea of halving heat demand, so you go to the orangey red, knocks about a quarter of the capacity you need off the future grid capacity. And what we're saying is that's about a 90 billion pounds. So why not take that money and begin to put that into retrofit instead of an oversized grid, for example? So you've actually got a grid which operates more efficiently across the year, for example. So that's just one example of a number of these. I'll summarize now. Talked about halving heat demand, a focus on driving the cost down, an alternative basic whole life, whole house approach for the mass market, vast potential to improve how we do retrofit, and that involves integrated contractual teams. Step change in productivity is absolutely key, and there's a whole set of arguments behind that, because at the moment it costs the UK about a third the cost to build wind turbines to save carbon as opposed to retrofitting homes. We want to get it on a level playing field and say we can do retrofit a lot more efficiently, and we get a lot of these at the bottom, the householder and social co-benefits that come out of this. So step change in productivity, but we'll be aware of those selling you more kit, new take on components and so forth I talked about, making sure nationally this halving of heat demand means we get to net zero carbon for no extra cost. And I've talked about is top-down issues, supply, energy supply, as well as energy demand, those benefits. Go and read this report, QR code there, as well as the address at the bottom. I will conclude now for discussions, although I have loads of other slides, but I know that if you have he says, right, am I back? Hello.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Chris. That's yeah, really interesting. I'm sure there's going to be plenty of questions that have jumped out from that. So, did anybody want to pop the hand up and ask their question? I see you put one in the chat, Robin, which is one that I was going to ask as well in terms of Sunamp. But do you want to come in and ask that, Robin?
I mean, like I can do. I mean, it's in the chat, but yeah, I did speak to Sunamp a year or two ago, and I know that kind of they were developing a specific one to deal with the lower temperatures that you get in a heat pump, as opposed to the ones you get to in a gas boiler. And when I spoke to them at a conference in Liverpool, November 23, they said they'd abandoned the heat pump PCM. So I think I'd seen like a company called Nanolope that was.
Can I stop you there? They haven't abandoned it,
Okay.
but what they have done is abandoned the developing of one for 50 to 55 degrees, because the switch to propane in the future than as a natural refrigerant means you're getting 5 degrees extra potential temperature for the same COP, which means their existing phase change works fine. So we don't need to develop a new product. So they are busily selling them for heat pumps at the moment, but they're large things that sit on the floor as opposed to they haven't developed anything which will fit on the wall. But I'm happy to have a separate chat offline if you want to go through these things in a little more depth, happy to do so.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I might take you up on that offer, Chris. I think Ian, who's on the board with me at Rossendale Valley Energy, might also be interested in that conversation. We have got it in our kind of techno-economic model with Sunamp, but it's a cost issue at the moment. But also my concern was around the temperature and how they're working. So yeah, that would be really helpful for us as well.
There's a certain amount one can go through with Sunamp. The idea that the a phase change is about 50% more expensive than hot water, but you save all the disruption and you needing an extra room and so forth and so on. But they're saying, we'd love to produce a new product, no demand. Therefore, there's a chicken and egg here.
Yeah,
which I think we can collectively unlock, if you saw what I mean. But absolutely happy to have further chat.
Yeah. No, thanks, Chris. I will pick up with you on that. Dan, do you want to come in?
Yeah, just a quick one, really, Chris. Thank you for that. I have actually read your report a few months ago, and I've seen you on YouTube as well many times. And it's a fantastic piece of work. I guess my question is, I'm just interested in what's needed to move this from a really compelling idea and a recommendation into some kind of reality. So who are you guys talking to at high level government, wherever it is, and who's listening, who's not listening? I know it's a big question, but
I would say it's splattergun. You know, it's not joined up. And what I'm hearing today is you seem to be more joined up than a lot of other people. Central government, where are the examples, they would say? Where are the prototypes? Where's the industry products? And you're saying, hang on, we need to put together something with enough critical mass, possibly approach innovation funding to be able to get certain products developed at prototype level and rolled out. We need to be looking at those integrated teams where we are able to build them. I know the MVHR, we can do far simpler. I spent 3 years working in Shanghai with Arup a few years ago, and they have a certain air quality issue. They have air handling units, heat recovery devices with 2 fans, a box, a heat exchanger for 400 quid. Whereas we're buying the same thing plus summer bypass, which we comprehensively analysed as somewhat irrelevant for the UK climate. We're ending up buying them for a minimum of 1,600 quid to £2,000 a time. So I'm not saying we go and buy them from China. We buy some examples from China. We do what they've done. We buy some examples, work out how they do it, and then we start making them for our market because there's 10 million homes out there which could do it. That's the kind of process we are trying to initiate, as opposed to, right, here's all the bits, run out there and go and do it, if you saw what I mean.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Right, thanks, Chris. And yeah, just on that point, we've had long delays on our MVAC for the Net Zero Terrace Street, which has slowed us down a bit, and they are expensive. We've got one that's a smart one as well, but we can only afford one of those. Michael, do you want to come in? And by the way, Michael, I owe you an email. I haven't forgotten.
Okay, thanks, Kate. Yes, thanks, Chris. In fact, I'm actually following up on Dan's question because it's basically that same thing. Is like, okay, so there's some things that need to happen in terms of the product innovation or product, not innovation, but in a sense scaling. But what kind of scale do you need? Say, effectively, again, if the community energy sector says, okay, like we want to do this, how big a scale do you need? How long do you need? What kind of basic? How big a task is it?
It's a very interesting question, because some people originally said, well, if you scale up, you can factor in an additional cost saving. We decided not to. We took a single house and worked out the time you need to do it, and therefore it becomes a building block. The issue is getting the team together, the supply chain of the equipment and so forth and so on together, as opposed to necessarily the scale of the development, if you saw what I mean. So I'd love to say as many as we can get, but we are not dependent on that for getting those cost targets. We're dependent on making sure your heat pump installer isn't hanging around for half a week until his next job, and you're paying through the nose in his overheads for the fact. So we're looking at productivity, and that is the key governor of what size or number of projects or dwellings you're looking at. You want someone moving from one to the next to the next to the next with no downtime. That is, I think, the criteria. I hope that helps, even if it's not a direct answer of
no, it is really helpful, because actually then you're back to, okay, it's a management of a project and things.
Yes,
and basically you
Community
energy, you build in those, it's
initially
demonstrator projects, you build it in to understand how it works.
And initially the innovation funding is to try and smooth over the fact you can't do everything as smoothly as you would like the first time round, if you see what I mean. But you have the target that after the innovation hump, the costs then come down to just a rollout set of costs, when you really do need the dwellings then to be lined up.
Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Michael, and thanks for that, Chris. Giovanna, do you want to come in? Good to see you.
Hi, Kate. Good to see you. Oops, I've got my mic. Yeah, hi, Kate. Good to see you too. I suppose. So I've read the report and looked at the YouTube video, and as a person who's not an engineer,
Yep.
who's mainly concerned with enabling retrofit at a local scale right now,
yeah,
I suppose my question to you is a very simple one: is what do you think we should be doing right now?
Right now, well, we have to understand how the industry works right now. So if you're wanting to consider insulation, we found that the cost of doing external wall insulation for a flank wall is about, well, if you look at the front wall is about 50% more expensive than doing the side wall. Surprise, surprise, it's because there's all the details, and I don't want to get into the detail for you, but you can appreciate different costs. You go to an insulation installer, they will never give you that flank cost. They will always give you the whole house cost. That is where you're starting from. And that's where we've got to start to unlatch some of this. And one's beginning to look at multi-skilled teams, for example, because actually, if you're restricting yourself to external wall insulation on basic house types, it's not rocket science. Mm-hmm. If you're looking at doing a heat pump of the sort I was looking at, which is you're leaving most of the heating system intact, for example, it's not rocket science, so on. And we need to therefore start to put together teams at that level to be able to do that. That is where I think one starts. And you've heard the comments about getting the right kind of kit, which is tailored and so forth and so on. But getting the teams, building them locally, building confidence with communities. So it's not just the eco enthusiasts. It might be the eco enthusiasts that start, but we need to be focused on how there's someone for whom it's not their goal in life to save the planet. How do we get them on board without, But that's where I would tend to start looking at teams of implementers.
Yep. And I do wonder whether there is a sort of, you know, a whole house plan, a retrofit scale whole house plan advice product we could build. I know you need to build the supply chains as well, but is there something we could do as a is there something we could do as a community energy sector? Because you're right, I have been watching, we've been doing whole house plans for years, and I've noticed that they disincentivize in retrofit, because what people get is whoa, that's way too much, all too scary, run away.
Yeah, that's it.
In
That's
response
it.
to the
We
whole
need
house
to
plan.
unlock that. We need to unlock that, and that's for the industry, supply industry, to contribute as well, as opposed to sitting in their little contractual boxes.
Thanks so much for that, Giovanna, and thanks, Chris. I think one of the problem, I mean, what we're trying to do with Net Zero Trial Street is create kind of that archetype foundational model that can then be lifted and shifted and nuanced, and all those points you make, Chris. I mean, one of our biggest problems has been that working with retrofit designers, etc., called, you know, they're past 2035, so they want to go deep retrofit, and we have to fight every battle with them to say, well, actually, we want good enough. We want to bring the heat load of the house down to meet the Kansas shoebox heat pump at 4.8 kilowatts. And that's been a really big battle. And it's been very expensive as well in terms of the assessments that they required. We are out of time. But Chris, I think we could probably go on for another hour. It would be great if people can mull over questions and perhaps come back with either to me or Joseph, and we can coordinate some questions, or you'd be very welcome to come. We have this as session monthly. You'd be very welcome to come back to the next one as well, because as you know, it's kind of an ongoing work.
These things are ongoing, and very happy to contribute, very happy to talk about even past 2035 and how one uses that at a more modest level, because there's nothing in it which says you have to go super deep in retrofit.
Yeah, no, that would be really useful.
Yep.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks so much again, Chris. We really appreciate your expertise and the time you've given us. And thanks for the questions, everyone, and the updates. And we'll see you again, no doubt, very soon. Thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of the week. Bye.
Great.